out of Washington that might affect California and might affect nationally?
So let me give you two examples, maybe. San Diego happens to be a growing center for biotech. Biotech is an incredibly important industry that we should lead in. We as a nation should lead in. When the stimulus package came out earlier this year, there wasn't any money for biotech, and yet there was plenty of money for construction. It strikes me that we need to change our point of view about the kinds of investments that are important to this nation's competitiveness in the 21st century and around the world. Let me give you another example. When General Motors and Chrysler were bailed out, lots of conversation in Washington, billions and billions of dollars to bail out, essentially, big business and big labor. The same week those bailouts were announced, 3,600 auto dealerships were put out of business. They received pink slips from General Motors and Chrysler. With those 3,600 auto dealerships, 156,000 people lost their jobs. Those 3,600 auto dealerships were small, community-based businesses. The 156,000 people, those are direct employees of auto dealerships who lost their jobs. That was a higher number in total than all of the direct employees of GM and Chrysler. And yet nobody in Washington said a word. They didn't say a word because small business doesn't have the big lobbies and the big dollars of big business and big labor, and yet small businesses employ half the people in this country. They create 2/3 of the new jobs in this country. Innovators, entrepreneurs, and small business owners are the engine of the American dream. And we don't think about that.
Well, I would have to agree with you on that. On the other hand, those guys were selling GM. And no one was buying it. So don't you agree that maybe
sure.
They should have decided they could have been a Toyota dealership?
Well, first of all, I must say I was never in favor of the bailout of GM and Chrysler.
In other words, let them kind of go through their own process.
Well, they went through it anyway in the end.
Yeah.
You remember the bailout was prefaced on the assumption that we would prevent layoffs, factory closures. None of those things were prevented. It's not at all clear that GM and Chrysler are more competitive today than they were before the bailout. I would argue less so because we delayed the inevitable. I also have said publicly that any company that comes to Washington and asks for a taxpayer bailout should also at the same time proffer the resignation of their entire board and their CEO, because they have failed in their most basic obligation, which is to protect the franchise. So it was not the auto dealer's job to create a competitive product. It was General Motors' job to create a competitive product. And it's also true that those auto dealers, in many cases, were family-owned businesses that had been General Motors dealers for literally generations.
Right, right. And from what I know of it, they've been lobbying for quite a while for better products. So.
Well, they knew where the traffic was going and not going.
Right, right. Despite the big balloons over the dealership. So I've got the.
Have you been buying a car lately or something?
I've been failing to buy a car lately. We ran a little contest on Twitter, and we asked people to ask whoever they wanted of all the folks we were having conversations with questions, and question for you won. So I'm going to ask a question from NMW. That's the handle. I actually believe his first name is Norbert, though he's now probably mad at me for telling everyone that. He's German, thank you. How do you think the World Wide Web / Internet should be governed, or should it be regulated?
Well, I do think that we're coming to the point where we need to acknowledge that the World Wide Web and the Internet cannot be forever a sphere apart from the rest of the world. The World Wide Web cannot be forever the Wild Wild West, where anything goes. So, for example, I do think that it's foolish to take the very complex, very onerous tax system that we have today in the physical world and just layer it onto the online world. I think we have to do, and by the way, I've thought this since 2000 when I testified before Congress on this point, so this isn't something new. But I think we need to focus on simplifying our tax system, but I think we have to now begin to blend the realities of online and offline. That is what's happening in the world. I don't think that we can permit the exploitation of women and children online that we would clearly indicate or believe is illegal and immoral offline. So yes, I think it is inevitable that the online world will begin to be more and more regulated and more similar to the offline world. Having said that, I don't believe that we should take things that clearly don't make sense in the offline world and just throw them onto the World Wide Web. I think it's an opportunity for us to reform what doesn't work.
Do you, we had Brian Roberts here earlier,
yeah.
and I asked him the same question, and around the idea of what has become something of a hot button recently because of Julius Janikowski, the FCC chair, making it so by declaring that the 4 principles of net neutrality that have been endorsed by the FCC but not put into policy officially. Do you have a point of view on that?
Well, I guess I would say it's probably not as educated a point of view as Brian's, because his business is at stake here, obviously. But I guess I would say that as people consider the principles of net neutrality, they ought to also consider what is it that motivates people to make investments. You know, I came from the communications world. So I started my career after I finished being a secretary and actually went on and got a business degree. I started at the Bell system and went through the Bell system through divestiture and many iterations. And the application of public policy by people who really don't understand what motivates business people to invest can be extremely counterproductive.
So you thought the breakup of AT&T was counterproductive?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that the logic that was used to divvy up that system created a lot of unintended consequences because people didn't think through, perhaps because it wasn't in their experience. Back to my comment about professional politicians, right. They didn't think through, why do business people invest? Right. What will cause them to make an investment in infrastructure that we want invested in?
So we had 8 years of the CEO president. Was he just not a particularly good CEO? I didn't write that one down, it just came to mind. I'm sorry.
I don't know where to go with that. I just don't know where to go with that.
That's pretty loaded, I'll admit. That's pretty loaded. Well, there'll be Q&A.
Your chance will come.
Yeah, your chance will come. I want to back up a little bit and talk about HP, because I said before that there's public scrutiny that's going to come from a bid for the Senate, and you had a spectacular, I think that's a fair word in all of its meanings and nuance, a spectacular tenure as the CEO of HP, both in success and then in controversy, and a wonderful, from the point of view of a journalist, a wonderful board fight, and then there was spying.
And it got even better after I left.
It got better after you left because there were journalists involved, which of course makes it much more interesting for journalists. Involved in spying and phone tapping and all sorts of wonderful stuff. It was very cloak and dagger. But do you, now that you have the benefit of time, look back at your tenure and have any lessons learned or regrets about how you ran HP?